The Blackwood Estate loomed against the stormy sky like a Gothic nightmare, its 47 rooms hidden behind iron gates that hadn't opened in 20 years. Jake Martinez stood at the entrance, eviction notice still crumpled in his truck, unable to believe this rotting palace was now his. The construction worker had inherited it from a great-aunt whose name he'd never even heard until the lawyer's call came 3 days ago. But Jake wasn't just any construction worker. Before his life fell apart, he'd been a forensic accountant who'd exposed too much corruption and paid the price. Now, as he pushed open the mansion's heavy doors, that forgotten expertise would save his life. Because inside the Blackwood Estate, Jake discovered rooms filled with financial documents, encrypted hard drives, and evidence of a money-laundering operation worth hundreds of millions. The house wasn't abandoned, it was a vault, and the people who'd been using it had just realized their secret was compromised. What would you do if inheriting your salvation also signed your death warrant? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The massive oak doors groaned on their hinges as Jake stepped into the cavernous foyer. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, filtering through grimy stained glass windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic that made his skin crawl. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. 3 days ago, he'd been facing eviction from his one-bedroom apartment. Now he stood in a mansion that could house a small village. The lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, had been oddly insistent during their brief meeting. "Your great-aunt Vivian specifically requested that you handle the estate personally," he'd said, nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "She left very explicit instructions that no one else was to enter the property until you'd had a chance to assess the situation." At the time, Jake had assumed the old woman was just eccentric. Rich people often were. But as he explored room after room, that metallic smell growing stronger, he began to understand there was nothing eccentric about Vivian Blackwood's final wishes. She'd been protecting him. In what had once been a grand library, Jake found the first anomaly. Behind rows of leather-bound books, a section of the wall had been converted into a sophisticated filing system. Bankers' boxes lined custom-built shelves, each labeled with dates spanning the last 2 decades. Jake pulled down a random box and opened it. Inside were financial statements from banks he'd never heard of, wire transfer records with amounts that made his head spin, and correspondence that mentioned Project Nightfall repeatedly. His forensic accounting training kicked in automatically. Even after 5 years of swinging hammers and pouring concrete, his mind still recognized the patterns. These weren't normal business transactions. The amounts were too large, the routing too complex, the documentation too deliberately obscured. This was money laundering on an industrial scale. His hands trembling slightly, Jake opened another box. More of the same, but from different years. Different banks, different shell companies, but the same underlying structure. Someone had been washing hundreds of millions of dollars through an intricate network of fake businesses and offshore accounts. And his great-aunt had been documenting every transaction. A sound from somewhere deeper in the house made him freeze. It was subtle, just the creak of old wood settling, but something about it felt wrong. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he strained to listen. Nothing. Jake forced himself to breathe normally. Old houses made noise. It didn't mean anything. But his instincts, honed by years of investigating financial crimes and the paranoia that had followed his fall from grace, told him otherwise. He quietly closed the box and moved toward the library's window. Through the grime, he could just make out his truck parked by the front gates. Next to it sat a black sedan that definitely hadn't been there when he arrived. His blood turned to ice. Jake backed away from the window, his mind racing. How had they found out so quickly? The lawyer's office must have been compromised, or maybe there was surveillance on the property he hadn't noticed. The metallic smell was stronger now, and Jake realized with growing horror what it was: fear. the sharp, coppery scent of adrenaline and terror that he remembered from his darkest days as a whistleblower. Footsteps echoed from the main hallway, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Jake grabbed the box he'd been examining and looked around desperately. There had to be another way out. Rich people always built escape routes into their homes, especially if they had secrets to hide. The footsteps were getting closer. Jake sat in his Honda Civic outside the law offices of Whitmore and Associates, staring at the brass nameplate through rain-streaked glass. The building looked like it belonged in a different century. Red brick facade, ivy creeping up the walls, windows that probably cost more than his monthly rent. He checked his phone again. Still 20 minutes early, but his landlord's latest voicemail about overdue rent had him too anxious to wait in the car any longer. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, looked him up and down as he approached her mahogany desk. Jake became acutely aware of his worn jeans and the coffee stain on his jacket sleeve. "Jake Martinez. I have an appointment with Mr. Whitmore at 2. She consulted her computer screen with the enthusiasm of someone reading an obituary. "Please have a seat. Mr. Whitmore will see you shortly." Jake settled into a leather chair that probably cost more than his car and tried to make sense of the past week. The call had come on Tuesday while he was installing drywall in a strip mall renovation, a crisp voice informing him that he'd inherited property from one Evangeline Thorne, described as his great-aunt on his mother's side. The problem was, Jake had never heard of any Evangeline Thorne. His mother had died when he was 12, and she'd rarely talked about her family. What little he knew suggested they'd cut ties with her long before Jake was born. "Mr. Martinez?" A tall man in an expensive suit emerged from an inner office. "Leonard Whitmore. Thank you for coming." Whitmore's office was all dark wood and leather-bound books, the kind of place where important decisions were made over expensive whiskey. The lawyer settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder. "I don't understand. I've never heard of this woman." "That doesn't surprise me. From what I gathered, there was a significant rift in the family. Miss Thorne never married, had no children. She was quite reclusive in her later years." Whitmore pulled out a document covered in legal text. "Nevertheless, she's left you her entire estate, including the family property, Ravenshallow Manor." The name meant nothing to Jake, but he nodded as if it should. "The property is located about 2 hours north of here, near the town of Millbrook. 47 rooms, situated on approximately 200 acres. Whitmore paused, studying Jake's face. "I should mention the house has been vacant for several years. It will require significant work." Jake's pulse quickened. Even in rough condition, a property that size had to be worth serious money. Enough to pay off his debts, maybe even start the contracting business he'd been dreaming about. "What's the catch?" Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly. "Catch? Come on. Nobody leaves a mansion to a relative they've never met without strings attached." The lawyer was quiet for a long moment, then reached into the file again. "There is one condition. You must live in the house for a minimum of 1 year before you can sell it." Miss Thorne was quite adamant about this clause. "Live there? For a whole year? The estate will provide a monthly stipend for basic maintenance and living expenses. Nothing extravagant, but enough to get by." Whitmore slid a set of keys across the desk. "These are yours, along with all relevant documents and property deeds." Jake stared at the ornate brass keys. They looked old, like something from a Gothic novel. One was larger than the others, probably for the front door. The metal was warm in his palm. "There's also this." Whitmore handed him a sealed envelope with his name written in spidery handwriting. "Miss Thorne left specific instructions that you read this only after you've arrived at the house." Walking back to his car 15 minutes later, Jake felt like he was floating. The rain had stopped and afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds like a sign. For the first time in months, maybe years, he had options. He could give notice to his current clients, pack up his cramped apartment, and start fresh somewhere new. He tried calling his best friend Carlos to share the news, but it went straight to voicemail. His excitement was too big to contain, bouncing around inside him like electricity. As he drove home, Jake found himself making mental lists. What to pack, what to sell, what to leave behind. The apartment held mostly furniture from garage sales anyway, nothing worth keeping if he was inheriting a mansion. The sealed letter sat on his passenger seat, corner bent from where he'd been fidgeting with it at red lights. Whatever Evangeline Thorne had wanted to tell him, it would have to wait. But the anticipation gnawed at him, mixing excitement with an odd undercurrent of unease he couldn't quite shake. The law office of Whitmore and Associates occupied the third floor of a tired brick building that had seen better decades. Jake climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight like a warning. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten dreams hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of instant coffee. He'd almost thrown away the letter 3 times. The official envelope had arrived 2 weeks ago, wedged between overdue bills and credit card offers. Estate of Margareta Martinez Voss, emblazoned across the top in formal script. The name meant nothing to him. Martinez was common enough, but he'd never heard his father mention any relatives beyond the immediate family, and most of them had been dead for years. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up from her computer. "You must be Mr. Martinez. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." Thomas Whitmore was older than Jake had expected, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd been practicing law since before computers existed. His office was a museum of legal documents, leather-bound books, and framed certificates that had yellowed with age. "Please sit," Whitmore said, gesturing to a cracked leather chair. "I must say it took us quite some time to track you down. Your great-aunt was very specific about finding you, though she left us precious little information to work with." "I've never heard of any great-aunt," Jake said, settling into the chair. "Are you sure you have the right person?" Whitmore consulted a thick file folder. Jacob Daniel Martinez, born March 15, 1989, to Robert Martinez and Susan Chen Martinez. Father deceased 2018, mother remarried and currently residing in Arizona. The details were accurate, uncomfortably so. Jake nodded. "Your great-aunt Margareta was your father's aunt, actually. Sister to your grandfather, though they hadn't spoken in decades. She was quite the recluse, lived alone in that enormous house for the better part of 40 years. Whitmore pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk. Jake's breath caught. The mansion in the photo looked like something from a Gothic novel, imposing stone walls, towering spires, and windows that seemed to watch. It was the kind of place that belonged to old money, the kind Jake had only seen in movies. "How neglected?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The house needs work, significant work. The electrical system is outdated, there are plumbing issues, and the roof requires attention. Your great-aunt lived in perhaps 6 of the rooms toward the end." Whitmore paused, studying Jake's face. "However, the land alone is worth a considerable sum. The local assessor valued the entire property at just over $3 million. The number hit Jake like a physical blow. $3 million. He thought of his empty checking account, the eviction notice stuffed in his glove compartment, the job interviews that never seemed to lead anywhere. This had to be a mistake. "There's one condition," Whitmore said, and Jake's stomach dropped. There was always a condition. "You must live in the house for a minimum of 30 days before you can sell or transfer the property." Margareta was very specific about this requirement. 30 days? Alone in a 47-room house with no electricity? "Oh, there's electricity. And heat. Your great-aunt wasn't completely impractical, but yes, you must establish residence there. After 30 days, you're free to do whatever you wish with the property." Jake stared at the photograph again. 30 days in a creepy mansion versus financial ruin. It wasn't really a choice. "When can I see it?" Whitmore smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. "I was hoping you'd ask that." He pulled a brass key from an envelope, old and heavy and ornate. "The address is on this card. I should warn you, the nearest neighbor is about 2 miles away, and cell service can be spotty. There's a landline in the house, though I can't guarantee it works." Jake pocketed the key, surprised by its weight. Did you know her? My great-aunt? Margaretha? Not well. She was intensely private, rarely came to town. When she did, people noticed. She had a presence about her, you understand. Very old-fashioned, very proper. But there was something else. Whitmore trailed off, then shook his head. Well, that's neither here nor there. She's gone now, God rest her soul. 20 minutes later, Jake sat in his beat-up Honda in the law office parking lot, staring at the key and the address card. The smart thing would be to drive out there in daylight, look the place over, maybe bring some supplies. But it was already past 3 o'clock, and November darkness came early. He started the engine. 30 days. He could survive 30 days anywhere for $3 million. Even if something about this whole situation felt wrong. The realtor's office smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Jake shifted uncomfortably in the cracked leather chair as Margaret Henley shuffled through a stack of papers, her manicured nails clicking against the desk. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I have to say, Mr. Martinez, you've inherited quite the property. She pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. The Blackwood Estate has been in your family for generations. Your great-aunt Eleanor was quite the character. Jake leaned forward. I'd never even heard of her until last week. My family doesn't really talk about the past much. Margaret's smile flickered. Yes, well, Eleanor was rather reclusive. Lived alone in that big house for nearly 30 years. The property is worth... She paused, consulting her notes. Well, it's complicated. The house itself needs extensive work, but the land is valuable. Prime real estate in this area. How valuable are we talking? In its current condition, perhaps $2 million. Fully restored, the sky's the limit. Though I should warn you, Mr. Martinez, maintaining a property of that size is extremely expensive. The yearly taxes alone... I'll manage. Jake's pulse quickened. $2 million. Even half that would change everything. What's the process for selling? Margaret hesitated, her fingers drumming against the desk. That's where things get interesting. There are some unusual clauses in your great-aunt's will, certain restrictions on immediate sale. You'd need to take possession first, spend some time there, get familiar with the property. How much time? 30 days minimum before you can list it. She slid a set of keys across the desk, old-fashioned brass things that looked like they belonged in a museum. I should also mention that several parties have already expressed interest in the property. Quite aggressive interest, actually. Jake pocketed the keys, their weight surprisingly heavy. What kind of parties? A development company called Meridian Holdings. They've been circling the property for years, ever since Eleanor stopped taking visitors. Margaret's voice dropped slightly. Between you and me, they're not the type to take no for an answer easily. Something cold settled in Jake's stomach. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, nothing illegal, of course. They're just persistent, very well connected locally. They've made several offers over the years, each one more generous than the last. She pulled out another document. In fact, I received a call this morning. They're prepared to make an immediate offer of $1.8 million, cash, sight unseen. No inspections, no contingencies. Jake's breath caught. Nearly $2 million right now, no questions asked. It was more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes. That's a hell of an offer. It is. Though I have to ask, why would someone pay that much for a property they've never properly inspected? Especially one that's been sitting empty for months. The question hung in the air between them. Jake stared at the keys in his palm, his mind racing. Margaret was right, it didn't make sense. Unless there was something about the property he didn't know. I want to see the house first, he said finally. Margaret nodded approvingly. Smart choice. Though I should warn you, the place has been without proper maintenance for some time. The electricity works mostly, and there's running water, but it's not exactly comfortable. And it's quite isolated. The nearest neighbor is miles away. She handed him a business card and a thick envelope. My direct number and copies of all the relevant documents. The property deed, tax records, your great-aunt's will. There's also a letter she left specifically for you. Jake tore open the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive paper, the ink faded but still legible. "Jake, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the burden passes to you. The house holds secrets that men have killed for. Trust no one, especially those who claim to want to help. The truth is in the walls, but be careful who you share it with. Some doors should never be opened. Eleanor." "What the hell does that mean?" Jake muttered. Margaret leaned forward. "I'm sorry." He folded the letter quickly, sliding it into his jacket pocket. "Nothing. Just family stuff. Mr. Martinez, I feel obligated to mention that if you do decide to explore the property, you should be careful. The house is old and there have been incidents over the years." "What kind of incidents?" "Trespassers mostly. People trying to get inside. Your great-aunt had to call the police several times in her final years. And there was that business with the previous caretaker." "What business?" Margaret's smile returned, but it looked forced. "Oh, probably nothing. He just left suddenly one night. Never came back for his things. People in town talk, you know how it is." Jake stood up, the keys burning in his pocket. Every instinct told him to take the money and run, but Eleanor's letter echoed in his mind, along with one nagging question. If the house was just a run-down mansion, why was everyone so desperate to get their hands on it? The rain hammered against the mansion's windows as Jake made his way down the main staircase, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The power had gone out an hour ago, and the backup generator he'd found in the basement refused to start. Every creak of the old floorboards seemed amplified in the darkness, making him second-guess his decision to stay the night. He'd spent the afternoon going through more of Aunt Cordelia's papers, finding little beyond decades-old utility bills and correspondence with various contractors. The woman had been meticulous about maintaining the mansion, even as it slowly succumbed to time and weather. What struck him as odd was how abruptly the maintenance records stopped, exactly 3 years ago, right around the time she must have died. A sudden bang from somewhere deep in the house made him freeze. Jake listened, straining his ears above the storm's fury. Just the wind, he told himself, though the sound had seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. He continued toward the kitchen, hoping to find some candles or battery-powered lights. The beam of his flashlight swept across the hallway, illuminating the portraits that lined the walls. Previous owners of the estate, he assumed, their painted eyes seeming to track his movement. One face in particular caught his attention, a stern-looking man in a military uniform from what appeared to be the 1940s. There was something familiar about his features, though Jake couldn't place why. As he entered the kitchen, his phone buzzed with a text message. The screen's glow seemed harsh after the darkness, and he squinted at the unknown number. "You shouldn't be there alone. Check the basement, east wall, behind the furnace. Come alone or don't come at all." Jake's blood chilled. Someone knew he was here. Someone was watching the house. He quickly moved to the kitchen window and peered out into the storm, but the darkness was impenetrable. His car sat in the driveway, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Another text arrived. "The people who killed your aunt won't hesitate to kill you too. Trust no one from town. Find what she hid before they do." His hands shook as he read the message again. Killed? The lawyer had said Cordelia died of natural causes. But then again, what did Jake really know about any of this? He'd accepted the inheritance story at face value, never questioning why a relative he'd never heard of would leave him everything. The smart thing would be to leave. Get in his car, drive back to the city, and forget about the mansion entirely. Let some other family member deal with whatever secrets were buried in this place. But curiosity gnawed at him, and something else, a growing certainty that he was already too deep to simply walk away. Jake made his way to the basement door, the old hinges protesting as he pulled it open. The stairs descended into absolute darkness, and the musty smell of decades-old dampness rose to meet him. Each step creaked ominously under his weight as he descended, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces. He found the furnace easily enough, an ancient oil-burning monster that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The east wall was lined with metal shelving units filled with paint cans, tools, and boxes of Christmas decorations. It took him 20 minutes to move enough items to access the wall behind the furnace. At first glance, it looked like ordinary stone foundation, but as he ran his hands along the surface, he found what he was looking for, a section that felt different, slightly loose. Pressing on it caused a small panel to swing inward with a soft click. Inside was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox. Jake's heart pounded as he pulled it free and opened it. The contents made his breath catch, stacks of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The photos showed various people entering and leaving buildings he didn't recognize, many with their faces circled in red ink. But it was one of the documents that made his blood run cold. A letter addressed to Cordelia Martinez, dated just weeks before her death, with a single line that stood out: "Your nephew's inheritance has been arranged as discussed. Ensure he receives everything, including this. He'll need it when they come for him." A loud crash from upstairs made Jake's head snap up. Footsteps echoed through the ceiling above him, slow, deliberate, searching. Someone was in the house. Jake quickly closed the box and tucked it under his arm, switching off his flashlight. In the complete darkness, he felt his way toward what he hoped was another exit. The footsteps above grew more urgent, and he heard voices now, at least 2 people, maybe more. As he crept through the basement maze, one thought consumed him. Whoever had sent those text messages had been right. He was no longer just an heir to a crumbling mansion, he was a target. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. The woman in the center bore an unmistakable resemblance to his great-aunt Elena, but younger, wearing what appeared to be a nurse's uniform from the 1940s. She stood among a group of serious-faced men in military dress, all positioned in front of a building that looked suspiciously like the east wing of the mansion. But it was the insignia on their uniforms that made his blood run cold. Sarah leaned closer, her breath catching. "Those are Nazi officers." The basement suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. His great-aunt, the woman who had left him this inheritance, had somehow been connected to Nazi operations during World War II. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered. But Jake was already moving toward another filing cabinet, his curiosity overriding his fear. The second drawer revealed more photographs, documents written in German, and what appeared to be detailed architectural plans of the mansion. Jake recognized the layout, every room, every corridor, even spaces he hadn't discovered yet. But these blueprints showed something else, a complex network of hidden passages and rooms throughout the structure. In the third cabinet, Jake found what appeared to be inventory lists written in meticulous handwriting. Numbers, dates, and cryptic notations filled page after page. Some entries were marked with red ink, others crossed out entirely. At the bottom of the pile, his fingers closed around something that made his heart stop. It was a leather-bound ledger, and when he opened it, genuine currency spilled out. Old bills, some British pounds, some American dollars, all appearing authentic, but somehow wrong in ways he couldn't immediately identify. "These have to be the counterfeit bills," he said, holding up a $20 note to the light. "From the war." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jake, if this house was used as a counterfeiting operation and your aunt was involved—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy between them. A sound from upstairs, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard, sent them both into immediate action. Jake stuffed several documents and the ledger into his jacket, while Sarah quickly closed the filing cabinets. They had been so absorbed in their discovery that they hadn't heard the car pulling up outside. Footsteps echoed above them, deliberate and searching. Jake pointed toward the hidden door they had entered through, but Sarah shook her head and gestured toward another section of the wall. Following the architectural plans he had just examined, there should be another passage leading from this room. She pressed against a section of stone that looked identical to the rest, and miraculously it shifted inward. Behind it lay a narrow corridor that disappeared into darkness. The footsteps upstairs grew more urgent, accompanied now by voices. At least 2 men, possibly more. They were systematically searching the house, their heavy boots moving from room to room with military precision. Jake and Sarah squeezed through the hidden doorway just as they heard the basement door open above. Sarah pulled the stone panel closed behind them, and they found themselves in complete darkness, pressed together in a space barely wide enough for 1 person. The passage stretched ahead of them, and Jake used his phone's flashlight to illuminate rough stone walls that looked far older than the rest of the house. They moved forward slowly, trying to muffle their breathing and footsteps. Behind them, they could hear the men entering the hidden room they had just vacated. "Someone's been here recently," a voice called out, carrying clearly through the stone. "The dust has been disturbed." Jake's blood chilled as he recognized the voice. It was the same man who had called him about selling the house, the one who had seemed far too eager to make a deal. The passage began to slope upward, and after what felt like an eternity of careful movement, they emerged through another hidden panel into what appeared to be a storage closet on the mansion's ground floor. Through the thin door, they could hear more movement throughout the house. These men weren't just searching randomly. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Sarah pointed toward a window, and Jake nodded. Whatever his great-aunt Elena had been involved in during the war, whatever secrets this house contained, they were dangerous enough that people were willing to break in and search for them decades later. As they prepared to climb through the window, Jake clutched the stolen documents against his chest. The inheritance that had seemed like salvation was rapidly becoming a nightmare, but he was too deep in to turn back now. Jake's hands trembled as he set the phone down, Marcus's words echoing in his mind. "They know you're there." The mansion suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap, its towering walls closing in around him. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains at the empty driveway below. Nothing but shadows and moonlight, but that didn't ease the knot in his stomach. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The leather journal felt warm in his hands as he opened it again, this time reading more carefully. His great-aunt's handwriting was precise, almost clinical, as she documented what appeared to be decades of careful observation and record-keeping. The entries weren't diary-like musings, but detailed accounts of meetings, phone calls, and financial transactions that made Jake's blood run cold. March 15th. Payment received. $2.3 million transferred to Cayman account 847B. Senator Morrison's vote secured on Defense Appropriations Bill. April 3rd, Blackwood Industries CEO contacted directly. Photos from 1987 incident sufficient leverage for environmental deregulation support. June 22nd, Supreme Court Justice Chen's gambling debts now total $890,000. Arrangements made for debt forgiveness in exchange for favorable ruling on pending case. Jake's mouth went dry. This wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was a systematic catalogue of high-level blackmail and bribery spanning years. His great-aunt hadn't been some eccentric recluse. She'd been running an operation that had its tentacles wrapped around the highest levels of government and business. A sound from downstairs made him freeze, the soft creak of a floorboard, barely audible but unmistakably there. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he strained to listen. Another creak, then silence. Moving as quietly as possible, he closed the journal and slipped it inside his jacket. The gun Marcus had given him felt heavy in his waistband as he crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway stretched out before him, a canyon of darkness punctuated by pale rectangles of moonlight from the tall windows. He stayed close to the wall, avoiding the spots where he'd learned the floorboards groaned. At the top of the grand staircase he paused, listening. The sound came again, definitely footsteps, trying to be stealthy but failing on the mansion's ancient floors. Jake descended one step at a time, wincing at every tiny sound. Halfway down, he could see into the main foyer. A beam of light swept across the far wall, a flashlight. Someone was definitely inside. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration unnaturally loud in the silence. Jake fumbled to silence it, but the damage was done. The flashlight beam swung toward the staircase, and he pressed himself against the banister, hoping the shadows would hide him. "I know you're here, Martinez." The voice was calm, professional. "Let's make this easy. We just want to talk." Jake didn't believe that for a second. People who broke into houses at midnight weren't looking for conversation. He continued down the stairs, each step a calculated risk. At the bottom, he could see the intruder moving through the living room, a tall figure in dark clothes, sweeping the flashlight methodically across the space. The kitchen. If he could reach the kitchen, there was a back door that led to the garden. From there, he could make it to his car and get the hell out of here. But that meant crossing 20 feet of open space while the intruder was less than 30 feet away. Jake waited until the man's back was turned, then moved. 3 quick steps across the marble floor, then he dove behind the heavy dining room table as the flashlight beam swept back toward his position. "There's nowhere to run," the voice called out. "The property is surrounded. Cooperate, and nobody gets hurt." Surrounded. Jake's escape plan crumbled. Even if he reached the back door, there would be more of them waiting outside. He was trapped in the mansion just as surely as if it had bars on the windows. The journal pressed against his chest through his jacket. Whatever was in those pages, it was worth killing for. His great-aunt had accumulated enough evidence to destroy careers, topple governments, ruin lives, and now that power, and the danger that came with it, belonged to him. Footsteps approached the dining room. Jake gripped the gun, knowing he was outmanned and outgunned, but refusing to go down without a fight. The beam of light crept closer, illuminating the chairs around the table one by one. Then the lights went out completely, not just the flashlight, everything. The entire mansion plunged into absolute darkness. In the confusion that followed, Jake heard muffled voices, urgent whispers, the sound of someone stumbling into furniture. Whatever had cut the power, it wasn't part of their plan. A new voice spoke from somewhere near the front entrance, clear and commanding, "Martinez, stay down. Help is here." Gunfire erupted in the darkness, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning. Jake pressed himself to the floor as bullets shattered china and splintered wood above his head. The weight of the gun in Jake's hand felt surreal as he crept through the mansion's darkened hallways. Every creak of the ancient floorboards beneath his feet sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence. The intruders had been quiet for the past 20 minutes, but Jake knew they were still there, methodically searching each room. He pressed his back against the wall near the main staircase, straining to hear any movement from the floors above. The carved wooden banister cast twisted shadows in the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. Jake's phone buzzed silently in his pocket, Elena checking in again. He couldn't risk answering. A muffled voice drifted down from the second floor. Male, authoritative, giving orders in hushed tones. Jake couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. They meant business. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake slipped toward the library where he'd hidden the documents. If these people were willing to break into his home, those papers had to contain something explosive. He needed to get to them before the intruders did. The library door stood slightly ajar, exactly as he'd left it. Jake peered through the gap, scanning the room bathed in silver moonlight. Empty. He eased inside, closing the door behind him with barely a whisper of sound. The loose floorboard was hidden beneath an antique Persian rug near the far wall. Jake knelt and carefully lifted the corner of the heavy fabric, his fingers finding the board that shifted slightly under pressure. He pried it up, revealing the small cavity where he'd stashed Great-Aunt Cordelia's secret papers. The hiding spot was empty. Jake's blood turned to ice. He ran his hands frantically through the space, hoping his fingers would find something he'd missed in the darkness. Nothing. The documents were gone. Looking for these? Jake spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale light from the hallway. She was tall, elegant, wearing dark clothing that made her blend seamlessly with the shadows. In her left hand, she held the manila envelope containing Cordelia's papers. Her right hand rested casually on what looked like a holstered weapon. "You're not as clever as you think, Mr. Martinez," she said, stepping into the room with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving in dangerous situations. "Did you really believe hiding these under a loose floorboard would keep them safe?" "Who are you?" Jake asked, keeping his own gun low but ready. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Someone who knew your great-aunt very well." The woman moved closer, her features becoming clearer in the moonlight. She was perhaps 50, with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Jake's appearance. Cordelia was supposed to destroy these documents years ago. Instead, she kept them as insurance. Insurance against what? The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Against people like me, against the organization that trusted her to keep certain secrets buried. She held up the envelope. "These contain evidence of operations that could bring down some very important people, Mr. Martinez. People who've invested considerable resources in ensuring their past mistakes stay hidden. So, you killed her." Cordelia died of natural causes, as unfortunate as that was for our purposes. We'd been monitoring her for years, waiting for the right moment to retrieve what she'd stolen. Her death complicated things, especially when she left everything to a nephew who didn't even know she existed. Jake's mind raced. "You've been watching me since I inherited the house." "Of course. We needed to see if she'd told you anything, if she'd left you any instructions about these documents." The woman tilted her head slightly. "She hadn't, had she? You stumbled onto them by accident. What's in those papers that's worth breaking into someone's home?" "Names, dates, financial records, evidence of a black operations program that officially never existed." She paused, studying his face. "Your great-aunt helped launder money for some very sensitive government activities in the 1980s and 90s. When she tried to get out, she kept copies of everything as life insurance. And now you want to clean up loose ends." "We want to protect national security interests," she corrected. "But yes, that includes eliminating any remaining threats to operational security." Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "So what happens now?" "That depends entirely on you." The woman's hand moved fractionally closer to her weapon. "You have two choices. Walk away from all this, sell the house, forget you ever found these documents and live a normal life, or continue asking questions and suffer the same fate as others who've gotten too curious about things that don't concern them. And you'll just let me go? After everything I've seen?" "You haven't seen anything yet, Mr. Martinez, but if you're smart, you never will." She stepped backward toward the door. "You have 24 hours to decide. Choose wisely." She melted back into the shadows, leaving Jake alone in the moonlit library with his racing thoughts and the terrible knowledge that his inheritance had become a death sentence. Jake's fingers trembled as he held the photograph, studying the faces of the 5 men in expensive suits standing around what looked like blueprints. The image was dated 3 weeks before his great-aunt's death. He recognized 2 of the faces immediately, Mayor Richard Blackwood and Police Chief Vincent Torres. The third man looked familiar, but Jake couldn't place him until he noticed the small nameplate on the conference table, Councilman Davis. The basement felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. Jake stuffed the photograph into his jacket pocket and grabbed the manila folder, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in the cramped space. Whatever Aunt Cordelia had discovered, it involved some of the most powerful people in the city. As he climbed the narrow stairs back to the main floor, every creak of the old wood sounded like a gunshot. The house felt different now, not just old and mysterious, but actively dangerous. He made his way to the kitchen and spread the folder's contents across the scarred wooden table under the dim overhead light. The documents painted a picture that made his blood run cold. Development permits for the historical district where the mansion sat, zoning variance requests, and most damning of all, a preliminary agreement to sell the mansion and surrounding properties to Meridian Development Corporation for $10 million, contingent on Cordelia Martinez's death. Jake's hands shook as he read the fine print. The deal would demolish not just his mansion, but 12 other historical homes to make way for a luxury shopping complex. The profits would be enormous, and according to these papers, they would be split among a very select group of investors, including the mayor, police chief, and 3 city councilmen. But Cordelia had refused to sell. The documents showed increasingly aggressive offers, then veiled threats, then finally a notation in red ink, subject proving difficult. Alternative measures required. The last document was a death certificate template, blank, but with Cordelia's name already typed in. It was dated 2 days before she actually died. Jake's phone buzzed, making him jump. The caller ID showed Elena's number. "Jake, where are you?" Her voice was tight with panic. "I just got a call from my contact at the newspaper. Someone's been asking about you, specifically about what you might have found in that house." "Elena, you need to listen to me carefully." Jake kept his voice low, even though he was alone. "My aunt didn't die of natural causes. She was murdered, and I know who did it." "What are you talking about?" "I found evidence. Photos, documents, everything. There's a conspiracy involving the mayor, the police chief. They wanted her dead so they could steal the property for a development deal." Silence stretched between them for several seconds. When Elena spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Jake, you need to get out of there. Right now." "Why?" "Because I can see 3 police cars turning onto your street." Jake's stomach dropped. He rushed to the front window and peered through the dusty curtains. Red and blue lights were flashing in the distance, getting closer. He counted 4 vehicles now, not 3. "They're not here to protect you," Elena continued. "My contact said the person asking about you was Chief Torres himself." Jake stuffed the documents back into the folder and ran upstairs to his bedroom. He threw clothes and essentials into a backpack, his mind racing. The hidden passage, could he use it to escape? But he'd never fully explored where it led, and getting trapped underground would be worse than taking his chances above. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the house. Jake grabbed the folder and headed for the back stairs, moving as quietly as possible. Through a rear window, he could see officers positioning themselves around the property. They weren't just here for questioning. This was a tactical operation. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Back door blocked. Side window, east wall. Hedge maze provides cover." Jake blessed her quick thinking. He knew the window she meant. It was in the old conservatory, partially hidden by overgrown ivy. He made his way through the maze of hallways, staying low and avoiding windows. Behind him, he heard the front door explode inward. "Police! Search warrant!" But Jake knew they didn't have a warrant. This was something else entirely. He reached the conservatory and carefully opened the window, wincing at the slight creak of old hinges. The drop to the ground was about 8 feet. He tossed his backpack out first, then the folder, then squeezed through the opening. The landing was harder than expected, sending jolts of pain through his knees, but he was outside, and the tall hedge maze Elena had mentioned was just 20 yards away. He gathered his belongings and ran in a crouch, reaching the shelter of the hedges, just as he heard shouting from inside the house. "He's not here. Check the basement." Jake worked his way deeper into the maze, following paths he'd explored days earlier. The ancient hedges were nearly 12 feet tall, providing perfect cover, but he knew this was just the beginning. Now he had evidence of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of city government, and they knew he had it. The hunt was just beginning. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the mansion as Jake pressed his back against the hidden door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Heavy footsteps thundered across the floor above, dust raining down from the ceiling with each impact. They were inside now, and they weren't being subtle about it. Sarah's fingers dug into his arm. "How many do you think there are?" Jake strained to listen, counting the distinct patterns of movement. At least 3, maybe 4. He pulled out his phone, the screen casting an eerie blue glow in the narrow space behind the wall. No signal, of course. The passage they'd discovered ran along the exterior wall of the mansion, barely wide enough for one person. Cobwebs brushed against Jake's face as he moved deeper into the darkness. Sarah close behind. The musty air tasted of decades-old secrets and decay. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing ahead. A thin line of light cut through the blackness, another hidden door. Jake pressed his ear against the wood, listening. Silence. He found the latch, a simple iron mechanism worn smooth by countless hands, and eased the door open just enough to peer through. They were in the library. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows between the towering bookshelves. Jake remembered this room from his initial tour of the mansion, though he hadn't paid much attention to it then. Now, studying it from their hiding spot, he noticed something odd about one section of shelving. The books were too uniform, too perfectly arranged. "Fake. We need to get to my car," he whispered to Sarah. "The keys are in my jacket upstairs. We can't go back up there. They'll—" A crash from somewhere above cut her off, followed by the sound of furniture being overturned. Whoever was searching the mansion was being thorough and destructive about it. Sarah grabbed his wrist. "Wait. Look." One of the tall library windows was sliding open from the outside. A figure in dark clothing slipped through, moving with practiced silence. Jake caught a glimpse of the intruder's profile in the moonlight. A woman with short, cropped hair and the lean build of someone who made violence their profession. The woman pulled out a small device, sweeping it slowly across the room. Some kind of scanner. She paused when it passed over the section of fake books, then moved directly to that shelf. Within seconds, she'd found the hidden mechanism Jake had missed entirely. The bookshelf swung inward, revealing another passage. Jake's blood turned to ice. The mansion wasn't just hiding one secret. It was riddled with them. A honeycomb of passages and hidden rooms that he knew nothing about. And these people, whoever they were, had maps. The woman disappeared into the newly revealed passage. Jake could hear her footsteps echoing from somewhere deep within the walls, growing fainter as she moved away from their position. "She's heading for the basement," Sarah breathed. "Whatever they're looking for, it's down there." Jake thought about the basement, trying to recall if he'd seen anything significant during his brief exploration. Just old furniture, wine racks, the mansion's ancient heating system. But then again, he'd obviously missed plenty of other things. More noise from upstairs. Voices now, too muffled to make out words but clearly coordinated. These weren't random thieves or vandals. This was a professional operation. "We have to get out of here," Jake said. "Now." They moved deeper into the passage, feeling their way along the wall. Jake's phone provided minimal light, but he didn't dare use the flashlight function, too bright, too visible. The passage seemed to curve along the mansion's exterior, following the foundation. After what felt like an eternity, they reached another door. This one opened to the outside, concealed behind an overgrown hedge. Jake had walked past this spot dozens of times and never noticed the carefully camouflaged entrance. The night air hit them like a slap, cold and sharp after the stifling atmosphere inside the walls. Jake could see his car in the circular driveway, looking impossibly far away across the open ground. "Stay low," he whispered, pulling Sarah toward the tree line that bordered the property. If they could circle around through the woods, they might be able to approach the car from the other side. They'd made it halfway to the trees when lights blazed to life across the mansion's facade. Every window seemed to glow, as if the house had suddenly awakened. Jake could see figures moving inside, systematic and efficient. Sarah stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk. "Jake, look!" She was pointing toward the road. Two black SUVs sat parked just beyond the mansion's main gate, their occupants waiting. Even if they reached the car, even if Jake's keys were somehow still accessible, they'd never make it past that roadblock. They were trapped on the property with professional killers who knew the mansion better than he did, hunting for something valuable enough to murder for. And Jake still had no idea what his great-aunt had hidden in this crumbling monument to secrets. A new sound reached them through the night air, the distant rumble of helicopter rotors growing steadily louder. The old service elevator groaned to life, its ancient cables protesting as Jake descended into the mansion's forgotten depths. The blueprints he'd found in Margaret's hidden safe had revealed something that chilled him to the bone. A sub-basement that didn't appear on any official records. 3 levels below ground, accessible only through this decrepit elevator that had been cleverly disguised behind a false wall in the kitchen pantry. The metal cage shuddered to a halt, and Jake stepped into a corridor that felt like stepping back in time. Unlike the deteriorating grandeur above, this level was sterile, utilitarian. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh white glow revealing concrete walls and polished floors that had been maintained with meticulous care. His footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the underground maze. The first door he tried was locked, but the ring of keys from Margaret's safe included several that looked different from the ornate house keys above. The third key turned smoothly. Jake's breath caught. The room beyond was a sophisticated laboratory, but not the kind used for legitimate research. Stainless steel tables bore the stains of substances he didn't want to identify. Chemical apparatus lined the walls, and a massive ventilation system hummed quietly, explaining how such operations could go undetected for decades. But it was the filing cabinets that drew his attention, hundreds of them, each labeled with dates spanning nearly 40 years. Jake pulled open the nearest drawer and found himself staring at photographs that made his stomach turn. Images of test subjects, though subjects seemed too clinical a term for what were clearly victims. His hands trembled as he flipped through file after file. Men, women, even children, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of people who had endured unimaginable suffering. Each photograph was accompanied by detailed notes in multiple handwriting styles, documenting experiments that violated every principle of human decency. "Project Blackwater," he whispered, reading the header on one particularly thick folder. Inside, he found correspondence between his great-aunt Margaret and someone identified only as the director. The letters revealed a partnership that had lasted decades, with Margaret providing the isolated location and the director supplying the funding and test subjects. Jake sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what he'd uncovered. The mansion hadn't been Margaret's home. It had been a front for human experimentation on a massive scale. The guests who had visited over the years weren't socialites or business associates. They were prisoners brought here to serve as guinea pigs for whatever twisted research the director was conducting. A soft sound from the corridor made him freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with the careful precision of people who knew exactly where they were going. Jake quickly stuffed several of the most damning files into his jacket and began looking for another way out. The voices were closer now, speaking in low, urgent tones. He caught fragments of conversation that confirmed his worst fears. They knew he was down here, and they weren't planning to let him leave with what he'd discovered. Jake spotted a second corridor branching off from the main lab. He slipped through the doorway just as the first figures appeared at the far end of the hall. These weren't the same mercenaries who had been watching the house. These people moved with the authority of individuals who belonged here, who had been part of this operation for years. The secondary corridor led to what appeared to be living quarters. Small, sparse rooms with the unmistakable feel of cells. Scratches on the walls told stories of desperation, of people who had known they would never leave this place alive. Jake's anger grew with each new horror he discovered, but he forced himself to keep moving. Getting killed down here wouldn't help the victims or expose the truth. He found what he was looking for at the end of the corridor, an emergency exit that led to a tunnel stretching away from the mansion. The heavy door required 2 of Margaret's keys working in sequence, a security measure that spoke to the paranoia of the operation's architects. Behind him, voices echoed through the lab as his pursuers discovered the open filing cabinets. Their shouts grew more urgent, and Jake heard the distinct sound of radios crackling to life. Whatever organization was behind this had resources and coordination that extended far beyond the mansion's grounds. The tunnel was narrow and poorly lit, but it was his only chance. Jake ran through the darkness, the stolen files pressed against his chest like evidence of humanity's capacity for evil. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, but finally he saw a glimmer of natural light ahead. He emerged into a copse of trees nearly half a mile from the mansion. breathing hard and trying to process everything he'd learned. The house wasn't just hiding secrets, it was an active crime scene, a place where horrors continued to unfold under the cover of Margaret's carefully constructed facade. Jake pulled out his phone, then hesitated. Who could he trust with this information? The local police were clearly compromised, and anyone connected to Project Blackwater had demonstrated their willingness to kill. He needed allies, but in this game of shadows and lies, distinguishing friend from enemy was becoming increasingly impossible. The basement stretched deeper than Jake had imagined, a maze of stone corridors that seemed to swallow the beam of his flashlight. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a metallic scent that made his stomach clench. Behind him, Elena's footsteps echoed in perfect rhythm with his own, while Marcus brought up the rear, his breathing labored from their frantic descent. "There," Elena whispered, pointing ahead where the corridor opened into a wider chamber. "That's where my father said the real vault would be." Jake swept his flashlight across the space, revealing walls lined with filing cabinets and metal shelves. But it was the massive steel door at the far end that commanded attention, a bank vault door with an old-fashioned combination lock. The brass nameplate above it read, "Blackwood Industries Private Archive." "Jesus," Marcus muttered. "How long has this been down here?" "Since 1962, Elena said, approaching the vault with reverence. "The year before my grandfather died. He moved everything here when he realized what they were planning to do to him." Jake ran his hand along the cold steel. "Please tell me you know the combination." Elena nodded, her fingers already working the dial. "My father made me memorize it when I was 12. Said someday I might need to finish what my grandfather started." The lock clicked with each precise turn. He never told me it would cost him his life. The final tumbler fell into place with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the entire basement. Elena grasped the wheel-like handle and pulled. The massive door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing darkness beyond. Jake's flashlight beam penetrated the vault, illuminating rows of document boxes, photographs pinned to corkboards, and what appeared to be laboratory equipment covered in dust sheets. The walls were covered with charts, maps, and typewritten pages yellowed with age. "Welcome to the truth," Elena said softly. They stepped inside, and Jake immediately understood why people had died for this room. The nearest corkboard displayed aerial photographs of a small Pacific island with handwritten notes in the margins describing test site, Charlie and population, 847 souls. Below the photos, a chart tracked mortality rates over a 6-month period in 1962. "Chemical weapons testing," Marcus read aloud, his voice hollow. "On civilians." Elena moved to another section of the wall. "It gets worse. Look at this." She indicated a series of documents stamped with corporate letterheads, Blackwood Industries, but also pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, even government agencies. They weren't just testing weapons, they were developing them for commercial use. Pesticides, industrial solvents, compounds that ended up in consumer products. Jake opened one of the document boxes, his hands trembling as he pulled out photographs that made his stomach lurch. Images of children with birth defects, villages where nothing would grow, workers in chemical plants who developed cancers at impossible rates. Each photo was meticulously labeled with dates, locations, and exposure levels. "Your great-aunt's father documented everything," Elena continued. "Every test, every cover-up, every death. He was going to expose all of it until they murdered him and made it look like suicide." A crash echoed from somewhere above them, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Marcus grabbed Jake's arm. "They're in the house." "There's another way out," Elena said quickly, pointing to a narrow passage at the back of the vault. "It leads to the old storm cellar on the north side of the property. We can take what we need and—" "No." Jake was stuffing photographs and documents into a canvas bag he'd found. "We take everything, every last piece of evidence." "There's no time," Marcus hissed. The footsteps above were moving systematically, searching room by room. "Then we make time." Jake's voice carried a determination that surprised even him. These people destroyed lives for decades, poisoned communities, killed anyone who tried to stop them. I'm not leaving this room until we have enough evidence to burn their whole operation to the ground. Elena began grabbing boxes while Marcus kept watch at the vault entrance. They worked in frantic silence, transferring decades of evidence into bags and boxes they could carry. Jake found himself staring at a particular photograph. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of a house that looked remarkably like the mansion above them. The notation on the back read, Maria Santos, 1963 to 1969. Liver failure consistent with chronic exposure. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. They're in the main hallway, Marcus whispered urgently. Jake pocketed the photograph and shouldered 2 bags of documents. Let's go. They moved toward the narrow passage Elena had indicated, but froze as new sounds reached them. Multiple sets of footsteps and the unmistakable static of radio communication. These weren't just corporate enforcers, this was a coordinated team. How many people know about this place? Jake asked. Elena's face had gone pale. More than I thought. The basement suddenly filled with a beam of powerful flashlights descending the main stairway. Time had run out. The basement felt like a tomb as Jake descended the creaking wooden stairs, Sarah close behind him. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the musty scent of decades-old secrets. There, Sarah whispered, pointing to a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. Where the other stones were roughly hewn and darkened with age, this area showed newer mortar, almost white against the grey backdrop. Jake ran his fingers along the edges, feeling the distinct texture. Someone sealed this up, recently by the looks of it. He pressed his ear to the wall and knocked gently. The hollow sound that echoed back confirmed his suspicions. There's definitely something behind here. They'd found the sledgehammer in the gardening shed, along with a crowbar and chisel that looked like they'd been waiting for this moment. Jake positioned a chisel against the mortar line and raised the hammer. The first blow rang out like a gunshot in the confined space. Sarah jumped, grabbing his arm. What if someone hears? We're 3 stories underground. Besides, after everything that's happened, I don't think we have a choice. He brought the hammer down again, harder this time. Chunks of mortar scattered across the floor. It took 20 minutes of careful chiseling before they could pry the first stone loose. Behind it, Jake's flashlight revealed not another wall, but empty space. A hidden room. As they removed more stones, creating an opening large enough to crawl through, the stale air that escaped carried something else, the faint smell of old paper and something metallic that made Jake's stomach clench. Sarah went first, her smaller frame making the passage easier. Jake heard her gasp from the other side. Oh my God, Jake, you need to see this. He squeezed through the opening, his shirt catching on the rough edges, and stood up in what appeared to be a natural cave that had been converted into some kind of archive. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, and several wooden tables held boxes, documents, and what looked like photographic equipment. But it was the far wall that made Jake's blood run cold. Photographs covered every inch of it, hundreds of them, spanning what looked like decades. Some were black and white, others in faded color. All showed the same thing, people in suits and formal wear, shaking hands, sharing meals, posing together in what were clearly private moments. Look at the dates, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was holding a photograph, her hand trembling. This one's from 1962. Jake, I recognize some of these faces. Jake moved closer, studying the images. Politicians, business leaders, men in military uniforms, all smiling, all unaware they were being documented. In the corner of each photo was a small stamp with a date and what appeared to be a reference number. He opened the nearest filing cabinet. Inside were manila folders, each labeled with a name and containing documents that made his mouth go dry. Bank records, copies of classified government documents, transcripts of phone conversations, even what appeared to be medical records. The folders were organized alphabetically, and Jake recognized name after name: senators, CEOs, judges, people whose decisions shaped the world. "This isn't just blackmail material," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is a whole network. Look at this." He pulled out a thick folder marked Operations Log. Inside were detailed records of payments made, favors requested, decisions influenced. The scope was staggering. Sarah had found another section, this one containing more recent material. "Jake, some of these photos are from last year. Someone's been maintaining this for decades." The implications hit him like a physical blow. His great-aunt hadn't just been a recluse living in a big house. She'd been running an intelligence operation, documenting and potentially controlling some of the most powerful people in the country. And now that information was his. A sound from upstairs made them both freeze, the distant creak of a floorboard. Jake killed the flashlight immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness. They stood perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear. Another creak, then another. Footsteps, deliberate and careful, moving across the main floor above them. "The stones," Sarah breathed in his ear. "We left them scattered everywhere." Jake's mind raced. Someone was in the house, probably investigating the basement by now, and they'd left a clear trail leading directly to their discovery. He felt along the table until his fingers found what felt like a small camera and several folders. He stuffed them inside his jacket. The footsteps had reached the basement stairs. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the back of the cave. Her flashlight clicked on for just a second, revealing another passage he hadn't noticed before. Narrow, but leading somewhere into the darkness. They moved as quickly and quietly as they could, leaving behind the archive that explained everything and raised 1,000 new questions. Behind them, light began to flicker against the stone walls they'd just breached. The smell hit Jake first. Antiseptic mixed with something metallic that made his stomach turn. Emergency room lighting cast harsh shadows across Detective Morrison's weathered face as she approached his gurney. Her expression was unreadable, but Jake could see the questions burning behind her eyes. "How are you feeling, Mr. Martinez?" Morrison pulled up a plastic chair, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor. "Like I've been hit by a truck." Jake winced as he shifted position. The doctors had cleaned and stitched the cuts from flying glass, but his entire body ached from the explosion's impact. "Any word on Dr. Chen?" "She's alive. Concussion, some burns, but she'll recover." Morrison opened her notebook. "Want to tell me what happened out there?" Jake stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains, while he decided how much truth he could afford. "Someone rigged the mansion with explosives. We barely made it out." "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? You inherit a mysterious mansion, start asking questions, and suddenly it goes boom." Morrison's pen hovered over the page, almost like someone wanted to destroy evidence. "You think I did this?" Jake's voice rose, drawing glances from passing nurses. "I nearly died in there. People have done stranger things for insurance money." Morrison's tone remained neutral, professional. "Tell me about your great-aunt Millicent. When did you first learn about her?" The questions continued for 20 minutes, each one probing deeper into Jake's story. He stuck to the basics: the inheritance, the discovery of hidden rooms, the research into his family history. He carefully omitted any mention of Marcus Webb, the consortium, or the bioweapons research. Some truths were too dangerous to share, even with the police. When Morrison finally left, Jake pretended to sleep until the nurse completed her rounds. Then he carefully pulled the 4 from his arm and slipped out of bed. His clothes, smoky and torn, hung in the small closet. Moving slowly to avoid triggering any alarms, he dressed and made his way to the emergency exit. The night air was cool against his face as he stepped into the hospital parking lot. Sarah's car was gone, towed away with the rest of the debris from the explosion site. Jake pulled out his phone and called for a ride, then waited in the shadows between 2 ambulances. 20 minutes later, he was sitting in the back of an Uber, watching the city lights blur past the window. The driver tried to make conversation, but Jake's mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments before the explosion. Someone had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to trigger the charges. The question was whether they'd gotten what they wanted. The hotel room Jake checked into was small and anonymous, the kind of place that asked few questions as long as you paid in cash. He collapsed onto the thin mattress and pulled out his laptop, grateful he'd left it in the car during their final visit to the mansion. The files Sarah had downloaded were still there, encrypted and waiting. Jake spent the next hour reading through research notes, funding documents, and correspondence between Millicent and various government agencies. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than he'd imagined. His great-aunt hadn't just been a scientist. She'd been a whistleblower. The final entries in her journal detailed her growing horror at how her research was being weaponized. She'd tried to destroy her work, but the consortium had already copied everything. Her death, Jake now realized, had probably not been natural. A soft knock at the door made him freeze. The sound came again, barely audible. Jake closed the laptop and moved quietly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The parking lot appeared empty, but shadows could hide many secrets. "Jake Martinez?" The voice was female, unfamiliar. "My name is Agent Patricia Vance, FBI. I know you have questions about your great-aunt's death." Jake remained silent, weighing his options. This could be another trap, another player in the deadly game he'd stumbled into. But it could also be the help he desperately needed. "I was Millicent's contact at the Bureau," the voice continued. "She was going to testify before a federal grand jury about the bioweapons program. She died 3 days before her scheduled appearance." That detail wasn't in any of the files Jake had read. Either Agent Vance was telling the truth, or someone had done their homework very thoroughly. Jake moved to the door but kept the chain engaged as he opened it a few inches. The woman standing in the hallway was in her 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that reminded him of Sarah. She held up an FBI badge and identification. "The explosion tonight wasn't random," she said quietly. "They're cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might expose the truth about Project Lazarus. You're in serious danger, Mr. Martinez." Jake studied her face, searching for signs of deception. Finding none, he slowly undid the chain and opened the door. "Come in," he said. "But if you're lying to me, we're both dead anyway." The encrypted files from Margaret's hidden drive scrolled across the laptop screen in Jake's cramped motel room. 3 days of running had led him to this seedy establishment on the outskirts of Bakersfield, where cash was king and questions weren't asked. His hands trembled as he decrypted the final folder, labeled insurance policy. What he found made his blood run cold. The documents detailed decades of illegal human experimentation conducted by Meridian Pharmaceuticals, using patients from state mental institutions as unwilling test subjects. Margaret's meticulous records showed how the company had systematically destroyed evidence, silenced witnesses, and buried the victims in unmarked graves throughout the California wilderness. The mansion hadn't just been a meeting place. It had been a processing center. The basement rooms Jake had explored were holding cells, disguised as wine storage. The hidden passages allowed researchers to move subjects without detection. The renovations in the 1980s had actually been the installation of a crematorium, later removed when the program shut down. Jake's phone buzzed with another blocked number. He'd stopped answering after the 7th death threat, but this time a text followed. "Your girlfriend is very pretty. Red hair, drives a blue Honda. Would hate for something to happen to her. Sarah." They'd found Sarah. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing her social media accounts. Her latest Instagram post showed her at the campus library, timestamped 20 minutes ago. Jake grabbed his keys and bolted for the door, then stopped. This could be exactly what they wanted, to flush him out of hiding, but he couldn't leave her exposed. The drive to UC Davis took 43 minutes of pure terror. Jake's mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. Meridian's reach extended far beyond what he'd imagined. The pharmaceutical giant had connections in law enforcement, government agencies, and corporate boardrooms. Margaret's files revealed a network of complicity that went to the very top of California's political establishment. The library parking lot was nearly empty when Jake arrived. Sarah's blue Honda sat under a flickering streetlight, but she was nowhere to be seen. Jake circled the building twice before spotting movement in a third-floor window. Someone was up there. The library's main entrance was locked, but Jake remembered Sarah mentioning the graduate student access on the east side. He slipped inside, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. The building felt unnaturally quiet, even for late evening. He found Sarah on the 3rd floor, hunched over a table surrounded by law books. She looked up as he approached, relief flooding her features. "Jake, thank God, I've been trying to call you for hours. We need to leave. Now." He grabbed her arm, but she pulled back. "Wait, you need to see this first." She gestured to the open books and printed articles spread across the table. "I've been researching Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Jake, they're involved in a class action lawsuit right now. Families of missing mental patients from the 1970s and 80s. Jake's heart sank. If the lawsuit was public knowledge, then his evidence might not be the smoking gun he'd hoped for. "Sarah, they know about you. They threatened." "The case was thrown out last month," she continued urgently. "Lack of evidence. But look at this." She pointed to a newspaper clipping. The lead attorney died in a car accident 3 days after the dismissal. And here, another article. One of the key witnesses committed suicide last week. The pieces clicked into place. Meridian wasn't just covering up past crimes. They were actively eliminating threats to their current operations. The company was preparing to release a new psychiatric medication, potentially worth billions in revenue. Any connection to their illegal experimentation would destroy them. "They're not going to stop," Jake whispered. "Even if I give them everything back, they can't risk us being alive." Sarah's face paled. "Then what do we do?" Before Jake could answer, the lights went out. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows across the library as footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. Jake grabbed Sarah's hand, leading her toward the fire exit at the far end of the floor. But as they reached the door, it swung open to reveal a familiar silhouette. Detective Morrison, the corrupt cop who'd been feeding information to Meridian from the beginning. "End of the line, Martinez." Morrison's gun gleamed in the dim light. "Miss Chen, you're coming with us. Your boyfriend has something that belongs to our mutual friends." "The files are already uploaded," Jake lied, positioning himself between Sarah and the detective. "Cloud storage, automatic release if anything happens to us." Morrison smiled coldly. "We disabled your internet access 3 hours ago. Nice try, though." More figures emerged from the shadows, corporate security dressed as maintenance workers, armed and professional. Jake realized they'd been herded here deliberately, every move anticipated and countered. As they were forced toward the elevator, Jake caught Sarah's eye and mouthed a single word: "Run." The game had changed. This was no longer about money or property or even justice. This was about survival. The abandoned subway tunnels stretched ahead like a concrete throat, swallowing their flashlight beams. Jake's lungs burned as he pressed forward, Elena close behind, their footsteps echoing off the curved walls. Behind them, voices grew louder. Voss's men had found the entrance. "How much further?" Elena whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Jake checked his phone's compass app. 2 more stations, then we surface near the federal building." They'd been underground for 20 minutes, following the route Marcus had mapped out before. God, had it only been yesterday. The memory of his friend's body in that warehouse made Jake's jaw clench. This had to end tonight. A distant gunshot cracked through the tunnel. Jake grabbed Elena's hand and they ran, splashing through puddles of stagnant water. Rats scattered in their wake, squeaking protests that seemed unnaturally loud. There, Elena pointed ahead to where a maintenance ladder climbed towards street level. "That's our exit." Jake boosted her up first, then followed, his shoulders screaming from the climb. They emerged through a grate into an alley behind the federal courthouse, the massive building's security lights casting harsh shadows between the dumpsters. "Agent Morrison should be waiting," Elena said, pulling out her phone. No signal. Shit. Jake peered around the alley's mouth. The street was empty except for a few late-night stragglers and the occasional taxi. Too empty. His skin crawled with the certainty they were being watched. "This feels wrong," he muttered. Elena nodded, tension radiating from her compact frame. "Morrison said to meet at the north entrance, but—" A black SUV rounded the corner, moving slowly, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like dead eyes. Jake yanked Elena deeper into the shadows. "That's not FBI," she breathed. The SUV stopped directly across from their alley. The engine idled, predatory and patient. Jake's mind raced through options, each one leading to the same conclusion: they were trapped. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against every instinct, he answered. "Quite a chase you've led us on, Mr. Martinez." Voss's cultured voice made Jake's blood freeze. "I have to admire your resourcefulness. What do you want?" "The same thing I've always wanted. The journal. My associates retrieved it from your little hiding spot, but I'm afraid it's encrypted, rather cleverly, I might add. Your great-aunt was more paranoid than we realized." Jake's heart sank. If they had the journal, then Sarah's evidence, their only leverage, was... "However," Voss continued, "encryption can be broken, given enough time and the right motivation, which brings me to Ms. Vasquez. I believe she's standing right next to you?" Elena's face had gone white. Jake grabbed her arm protectively. "Here's my proposal," Voss said. "You both walk out of that alley in the next 60 seconds. You get in the vehicle. In exchange, I'll make this quick, clean, professional. The alternative is considerably less pleasant." The line went dead. Elena was already moving, checking her weapon. "How many rounds do you have left?" "3. Jake's hands shook as he verified his clip. "Elena, this is insane. We can't shoot our way out of this. Watch me." But as she spoke, 2 more SUVs appeared from opposite directions, boxing them in completely. Men in tactical gear emerged, moving with military precision. Jake counted at least 8 weapons trained on their position. 60 seconds are up," a voice called from across the street. Not Voss, someone younger, with a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Time to go, Mr. Martinez." Elena's finger tightened on her trigger. Jake could see her calculating angles, distance, odds of survival. All of them terrible. "Wait," Jake said loudly. "I want to talk to Voss. He's waiting in the car." Jake stepped out of the alley, hands raised, Elena reluctantly following. The lead SUV's rear window descended, revealing Voss's patrician features. Even in defeat, the man looked like he was attending a board meeting. "The encryption," Jake said. "It's biometric, retinal scan. You need me alive to access it." Voss studied him for a long moment. "Clever, but not entirely true, I suspect. Retinal scans can be harvested posthumously given the right equipment." "Then why not just kill us here?" "Because," Voss smiled, "I believe your great-aunt built in additional safeguards. Voice recognition, perhaps, behavioral patterns. She was thorough that way." He leaned forward. "Besides, there's the matter of your journalist friend, Ms. Chen. She's proven remarkably difficult to locate. I'm hoping you might provide some insight into her whereabouts." Jake's blood turned to ice. Sarah. They hadn't found Sarah, which meant she was still out there, still fighting. "Get in the car, Mr. Martinez, both of you. It's time we concluded this business properly." The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place for what Jake had in mind. Isolated, forgotten, and far enough from civilization that if things went wrong, innocent people wouldn't get caught in the crossfire. He pulled his rental car behind a stack of rusted shipping containers and killed the engine, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The USB drive felt impossibly heavy in his jacket pocket. 3 days had passed since he discovered the truth about the Blackwood Foundation's human trafficking operation, and every moment since had been a careful dance of preparation and paranoia. He'd moved hotels twice, paid for everything in cash, and avoided using his phone except for the single cryptic message he'd sent to Victoria Blackwood, Pier 47 warehouse. Midnight. Come alone, or everything goes public at sunrise. Jake checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. The building loomed before him like a skeletal giant, its broken windows reflecting fragments of moonlight. He'd arrived early to set up, hiding backup copies of the evidence in strategic locations throughout the structure. If something happened to him tonight, the truth would still find its way out. The crunch of gravel under tires made his pulse spike. Headlights swept across the warehouse wall before cutting out, leaving only darkness and the distant hum of the approaching vehicle. Jake positioned himself behind a concrete pillar near the center of the building, giving him clear sightlines to all entrances while maintaining cover. Victoria Blackwood entered through the main door exactly at midnight, her silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light filtering through the broken roof. She wore a long black coat and moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. But she wasn't alone. Jake counted at least 3 shadows moving along the perimeter of the building. "Mr. Martinez," Victoria called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I received your rather dramatic invitation, though I must say your choice of venue lacks a certain sophistication." Jake stepped partially into view but kept the pillar between them. "Seemed appropriate for the kind of business your foundation really conducts." She laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Ah, so you've been busy playing detective. I wondered when you'd stumble onto something you'd regret finding." "The shipping manifests from your great-aunt's files," Jake continued, his voice steadier than he felt, "the coded communications, the financial records showing payments to shell companies across 3 continents. How long has the Blackwood Foundation been using charity work as cover for human trafficking?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the subtle hand signal she gave to her unseen associates. They were moving closer. "Aunt Eleanor was always too sentimental," Victoria said, beginning to walk slowly toward his position. "She kept records of everything, couldn't bear to destroy the evidence of what we'd built together. I suppose she thought of it as preserving history." "History?" Jake's anger flared. "You're talking about people's lives, families destroyed, children who would have died in poverty anyway," Victoria snapped, her mask of civility finally slipping. "We gave them purpose, value. The families we helped relocate found better lives than they ever could have imagined. You sold them. We provided opportunities." She was close enough now that Jake could see the cold calculation in her eyes. "The foundation has moved nearly 2,000 individuals to new lives over the past 15 years. The profit from those transactions has funded hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects across a dozen developing nations. We've done more good than 100 conventional charities by treating people like commodities." Victoria shrugged. "The world is full of suffering, Mr. Martinez. We simply found a way to monetize it efficiently." Jake's hand moved toward his pocket where the USB drive waited, but Victoria was faster. The gun appeared in her hand with practiced ease, its barrel pointed directly at his chest. "I really hoped we could resolve this amicably," she said with genuine regret. "The Foundation could use someone with your resourcefulness. But I see now that you lack the vision to understand what we're truly accomplishing. The FBI will understand perfectly when they see the evidence." Victoria smiled. "What evidence? You mean the USB drive in your left jacket pocket? Or perhaps the backup files you've hidden around this building? Did you really think we wouldn't be watching you for the past 3 days?" Jake's blood turned to ice as armed figures emerged from the shadows, 4 of them, positioned at every possible exit. The warehouse that had seemed like the perfect place for a confrontation now felt like an expertly constructed trap. "You see, Mr. Martinez, the Blackwood Foundation didn't become successful by leaving loose ends. We've had considerable practice at making problems disappear." Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger. "Your inheritance was supposed to be a simple real estate transaction. Instead, you've become a very expensive complication." The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the night air, growing steadily louder. The mansion's foundation groaned as Jake pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the wine cellar, his breath coming in short bursts. Above him, footsteps echoed through the corridors, slow, deliberate, searching. Detective Morgan's voice carried down the stairs, muffled but urgent, as she coordinated with the FBI team that had finally arrived. 3 hours had passed since the confrontation in the library. 3 hours since Victoria Ashford lay bleeding on the Persian rug, her confession spilling out like wine from a broken bottle. The Meridian Group's web of corruption stretched further than Jake had ever imagined. Judges, senators, CEOs, all connected by the documents hidden within these walls for over 70 years. Jake's fingers traced the leather portfolio in his hands, the one his great-aunt Eleanor had died protecting. Inside were photographs, financial records, and correspondence that could topple governments and destroy empires. The weight of it felt heavier than the crumbling mansion above. "Jake," Morgan's voice called from the cellar entrance. "You can come up now, they're gone." He emerged to find the mansion transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across doorways, and investigators moved through rooms he'd barely explored. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped at 11:47, as if time itself had surrendered to the chaos. Morgan approached, her badge reflecting the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and a small bandage covered a cut on her temple where Ashford's security chief had struck her during the struggle. "The last of Ashford's people are in custody," she said, accepting the portfolio Jake handed her. "But you know this isn't over. The Meridian Group has resources we're only beginning to understand." Jake nodded, watching as federal agents photographed the library where everything had unraveled. The hidden panel behind the bookshelf remained open, revealing the small chamber where Eleanor Martinez had concealed the truth for decades, a truth that had cost her life and nearly claimed his own. "She knew they'd come eventually," Jake said, thinking of his great-aunt. "That's why she left everything to me. She needed someone outside their circle, someone they wouldn't see coming." Through the mansion's windows, Jake could see news vans gathering beyond the iron gates. The story was already breaking. Whispers of corruption, murder, and a 70-year-old conspiracy hidden within the walls of a forgotten estate. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and people claiming to be relatives he'd never heard of. Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI task force leader, approached with a grim expression. "We'll need you in protective custody while we process all this," she said, gesturing toward the portfolio. "These documents implicate some very dangerous people. The surviving members of the Meridian Group won't hesitate to tie up loose ends." Jake looked around the mansion one last time, taking in the ornate moldings, the dust-covered portraits, and the secrets embedded in every shadow. When he'd first inherited this place, he'd seen only dollar signs, a solution to his mounting debts and failed dreams. Now he understood it was something else entirely, a burden, a responsibility, and perhaps a chance for justice. "What about the house?" he asked. "It's evidence now," Chen replied. "Could be months before you can access it again, and even then—" She shrugged. "Places like this, with this much history, sometimes it's better to let them go." As they prepared to leave, Jake walked through the main hall one final time. His footsteps echoed in the vast space, and he could almost hear the whispers of decades past. Eleanor's voice warning of dangers yet to come, the hushed conversations of conspirators who'd thought their secrets were buried forever. Outside, the autumn air felt sharp and clean after the mansion's mustiness. Jake climbed into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, watching through the rear window as the mansion grew smaller. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across its weathered facade, and for a moment it looked almost peaceful. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Maria, saw the news. "Are you okay?" Jake stared at the message, realizing that for the first time in months he could honestly answer yes. The financial problems that had driven him to accept this inheritance seemed insignificant now compared to what he'd survived. The mansion had given him something more valuable than money. It had given him purpose. As the car pulled away from the estate, Jake caught one last glimpse of the mansion through the trees. Somewhere in those 47 rooms, Eleanor Martinez's spirit could finally rest. The truth she'd guarded with her life was now in the right hands, and the powerful men who'd thought themselves untouchable would face the judgment they'd avoided for 70 years. The deadly game was over, but Jake Martinez understood that his real life was just beginning.